everybody here this evening. What we're going to talk about tonight is where now? After same-sex marriage, many people have concluded that it's all over, that the battle for LGBTI rights in Britain is more or less finished. My argument is, yes, we've made tremendous progress, but there's more to do. So my starting point is, first of all, to say thank you to all of you and many others who've been part of this stupendous civil rights struggle that has brought Britain to a place where we are one of the best countries in the world when it comes to LGBT legal equality. That battle is quite extraordinary. When you think that in 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. Some of them dating back decades and even centuries. You're all familiar with the arrest and trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895. The law that sent him to prison in that year was only finally repealed in 2003. The law against anal sex, so-called buggery, passed in 1533 during the reign of Henry VIII, was only repealed 11 years ago. So the criminalisation of homosexuality in this country has continued until very recently. The 1967 Sexual Offences Act was a very partial, limited decriminalisation. All those traditional historic laws remained in place on the statute book under the heading of, quote, unnatural offences. It is only since the Sexual Offences Act of 2003 that we have a criminal code that does not discriminate on the grounds of sexual orientation. And of course, I mentioned 1999 because that was the year when the first major reform took place, when in response to a judgment in the European Court of Human Rights, the Labour government ended the ban on lesbian, gay, bisexual people serving in the armed forces. That was the first major reform, followed very soon afterwards by the equalisation of the age of consent, by the right of same-sex couples to foster and adopt children, by the laws prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation in the workplace, and later in the provision of goods and services, the repeal of Section 28, the legislation of civil partnerships, and of course, last year, the legalisation of same-sex marriage. It has been a phenomenal pace of change. I can't think of any other law reform campaign in British history that has succeeded in changing so many laws in such a short space of time, in literally just over 1 decade. And as I said, that is a real tribute to you and the tens of thousands of other LGBTI people and our much valued straight allies who've made that possible. And it didn't just happen in 1999 since. It is down to the efforts of people going way back to the 1950s and 60s. People like Jackie Forster, Alan Horsfall, Anthony Gray, and many others who pioneered and championed the campaigns for law reform and equality all those decades ago. So we have come to a place where, as I said, Britain has some of the best laws in the world for LGBTI people. But of course, I mentioned there is still work to be done. Now, I was very surprised in 2010, the British Social Attitude Survey was published, where they found that still, in that time, 36% of the British public believed that homosexuality was mostly or always wrong. Now, I suspect it's probably gone down a bit since then, but even to think that in 2010, 36% of the public believed that, that's quite shocking. I think it shows that there are still attitudes that need to be challenged. There's still education that needs to be done. So maybe starting with same-sex marriage. I'm personally not a great fan of marriage. I tend to share the feminist critique. I see marriage as being a traditionally heterosexist institution which embodies patriarchy and misogyny. So speaking personally, I would not want to get married. But as you know, beginning with outrage in 1992, I spearheaded the challenge to overturn the ban on same-sex marriage. Not because I was a great supporter of marriage, but because the ban was homophobic discrimination. Because I believe that regardless of my own personal viewpoint, in a democratic society, we should all be equal before the law. So for those who don't know, in 1992, Outrage, the LGBTI direct action group, organised 5 same-sex couples to file an application for civil marriage at Westminster Register Office in London. All were refused, but that was the opening shot in the long campaign. And way back in 2010, it was given a new lease of life with the formation of the Equal Love campaign. Again, organised by Outrage, but with the support of my own Tatchell Foundation and many other organisations. Now, that campaign had 2 goals. First of all, to end the ban on same-sex civil marriage, but also to end the ban on opposite-sex civil partnerships. So we've won one of those claims. We now have same-sex marriage, but we still don't have the right of straight couples to have a civil partnership if they wish. And for me, again, based on the principle of equality before the law, I find it really offensive that straight couples should be denied by law the right to have a civil partnership. If we're going to have a law, it should be open to everyone without discrimination. But going back to same-sex marriage, it is an advance, but it's not equality. We now have 2 separate marriage laws. We have the 1949 Marriage Act, which is for opposite-sex couples only, and we have the 2013 Marriage Act, which is for same-sex couples only. In effect, we have legal segregation. We have segregation in law, a form of sexual apartheid, if you like. One law for straights, another for gays. And that is a very, very bad principle on which to make law. To segregate us and separate us in a separate legal framework is fundamentally wrong. It is not equality. Separate is never equal. Now, for those who perhaps are not aware, under the 1949 Marriage Act, which is the main marriage law of this country, there is no prohibition on same-sex marriage. That was only introduced in 1971 in response to the emergence of the Gay Liberation Front, the Women's Liberation Movement, and in particular, the heroic struggles of a handful of individuals, mostly transgender, who sought to have their marriages recognised. You're all familiar, I hope, with April Ashton, one of the great pioneers of trans rights in this country. To stop her making a valid claim that she was lawfully married, the government of the day introduced the Nullity of Marriage Act, which for the first time in British law prohibited same-sex marriage. And that was then transferred to the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973. So in fact, all the government had to do was repeal the relevant clauses in the 1973 Matrimonial Causes Act, and then revert to the 1949 Marriage Act. There was no need for a whole new legal legislative framework. Moreover, of course, this new law embodies some aspects of discrimination. The rights and responsibilities are not quite the same, but most particularly, we have discrimination in pension inheritance in the event of one partner dying. So if you're in a straight marriage a straight couple in a marriage under the 1949 Act, if a deceased partner had been paying into their pension pot since 1960, their surviving partner will be able to claim their pension rights going back to 1960. But if you're in a same-sex marriage, under the law, you'll only be able to claim back by law from 2005, even if your deceased partner had been paying in to the pension pot since 1960. In other words, you will lose 45 years of pension contributions simply because you're married under the wrong act and you've got the wrong sexual orientation. That is outrageous discrimination. You also know that under this legislation, the government has introduced what's called the quadruple lock to prevent by law the Church of England and the Church of Wales from presiding over same-sex marriages, even if they wish to. Now, right now, they're not going to agree because the church leadership has bullied their congregations and their priests and bishops into line that they will not allow same-sex marriages. But by having this legislative prescription, which says that even if the church subsequently decides it wants to or is willing to conduct same-sex marriages, it will not be allowed to by law, that's not only homophobic, it's an attack upon religious freedom. It's saying that the Church of England and Church of Wales cannot conduct same-sex marriages even if they want to. What would be requires a whole new government regulation or legislation in order to change that. Again, a very bad principle of law. As I mentioned, we still haven't won the right of opposite-sex couples to have a civil partnership. When the government did its consultation on same-sex civil marriage, to humour me, they agreed to insert a question about should opposite-sex couples be able to have a civil partnership if they wish to. I've been so critical of the legislation, they thought, well, if they gave me this small concession by including that question, that might shut me up and calm me down. What they didn't expect was the answer they got. 61% of respondents said, yes, heterosexual couples should be allowed to have a civil partnership if they wish to. The government didn't like the result, so what they did is they asked the question again. They did a consultation earlier this year to ask the question again. And this time, of course, they forewarned the churches who were opposed to civil partnerships for straight couples because they thought it would undermine marriage. And so, of course, overwhelmingly this time, the churches swamped the consultation and the balance of support for opposite-sex civil partnerships switched the other way. So the government was able to then sit back and say, look, we've consulted again, and the vote has gone against, so we're going to leave things as they are, straight couples are banned. Again, this is not what we expect from a democracy, where every person should be equal before the law. Now, when it comes to our equality laws, we do have many very good laws. Laws prohibiting discrimination in the workplace and in the provision of goods and services. We have the Equality Act of 2010, a milestone legislation which ended the patchwork of different equality laws for different communities to create a single, unified legal framework where everyone has redress against discrimination, where everyone is guaranteed equal rights. It created a level playing field for discrimination based on race, gender, age, sexuality, gender identity, religion or belief. Fantastic. But written in to all those equality laws are qualified exemptions for religious organisations. Not just places of worship, but also faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and shelters for the homeless. They are all allowed, if they believe it is required to uphold their religious ethos, to discriminate in employment and in the provision of services. That again is a very, very bad principle. You know, the idea that just because someone holds a religious belief that they should be allowed to discriminate against LGBTI people, that is fundamentally wrong. Now, I will defend the right of people of faith to hold their viewpoint, even though I disagree with it. I will defend their right to hold their point of view. But I will never countenance their right to discriminate. That is not consistent with democratic principles, with an equality ethos, or, for that matter, with the fundamental tenets of all the major religions. You know, discrimination is not a religious value. So that's unfinished business. To get those laws changed, to remove those religious exemptions. Another issue is, of course, the question of enforcement. It's fantastic to have equality laws, but then it all depends on how they're interpreted and enforced. You're familiar with the fact that a number of Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers have put out tracks that openly encourage and glorify the murder of LGBTI people. Now, these tracks aren't merely homophobic, they actually incite the killing of other human beings who happen to be LGBTI. Incitement to murder is a criminal offence in Jamaica, Britain, and almost every country in the world. Yet never once have any of these singers been prosecuted. In fact, successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, have given them visas and work permits to come to this country to make money out of murder music. It's all very well for the Home Secretary to ban Julian Blanc, to ban various other people like Geert Wilders. I tend to agree with those. But none of these people have actually advocated murder, whereas these singers have, and they haven't been banned. So just think about it. Why the double standards? Why are some people banned and not others? And why are people banned for never advocating violence, whereas those who advocate violence are welcomed and given work permits and visas? I'm sure many of you are aware of the leader of the Nation of Islam in the United States. I don't agree with his politics or his religious beliefs, but as far as I know, he's never ever advocated violence. Yet he's been banned for over 20 years. Again, it strikes me as double standards. Double standards. Louis Farrakhan, he is entitled to his point of view. Even though I disagree with it, he's entitled to his point of view. He should not be banned from this country. He is the leader of a Nation of Islam, which I disagree with, but I will defend, in a free society, his right to state his point of view, providing he doesn't encourage violence or murder. I'm sure you're also familiar with the case of a number of Islamist clerics, Sheikh Abdullah Al-Faisal, who about a decade or so ago advocated the murder of Jews and Hindus. He was promptly arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. In my view, actually quite an excessive sentence, but nevertheless, he was sentenced. So shortly afterwards, Imam Abdul Muhid in East London did exactly the same thing, only he advocated killing gay people. Despite the fact there were 4 witnesses the Crown Prosecution Service refused to prosecute him. Again, why the double standards? Why does Al-Faisal get 9 years in jail and Muhid not even get taken to court? What's that say about attitudes of the state authorities towards LGBT people? Another issue which is unresolved is the ongoing mistreatment of LGBTI refugees, people fleeing persecution in viciously homophobic and transphobic countries around the world. These are people who've come to Britain seeking a safe haven. Many of them have been threatened or assaulted by homophobic mobs. Some have been arrested and imprisoned and even tortured. Yet they come here and they have to battle to get asylum. Now, of course, it's not just LGBTI refugees who have a tough time. The whole asylum system is rigged to fail as many people as possible. Successive governments dance to UKIP. First of all, the amount of money for legal aid has been dramatically cut, so that no solicitor can prepare a proper, adequate asylum claim based on the money available. Often, these refugees are detained in asylum detention centres, which are really basically glorified prisons by another name. How astonishing that these are people who may have themselves been imprisoned in their home countries for their sexual orientation or gender identity. They come here seeking refuge, and we put them in a place that is an equivalent of a prison. They're also often put on what's called fast track, where they have about 2 weeks to prepare a claim and to do their appeal. Well, first of all, in detention, you don't have the capacity to prepare a proper asylum claim. You don't have access to get witness statements, to gather material evidence to prove your sexuality. And under fast track, it's even worse. You've got so few days to get your claim in order. As I said, the system is designed to fail as many people as possible. A favourite tactic of the government now is to dispute people's sexuality, to sometimes acknowledge that they're being abused and threatened and perhaps even had violence done to them. But then to turn around and say, well, we don't believe you're gay. And they'll say that to people who have produced love letters, photographs, shared bills, all the kinds of things that two people in love might share with each other. Despite this evidence, they're told, we don't believe you're gay. The question is, how does an LGBTI person prove their sexuality or gender identity if that material evidence is discounted, as it is so often? The government refuses to say. They say we don't accept your sexuality, but they won't say what a person would have to do to prove their sexuality. You may know that some LGBT refugees have gone to the extraordinary extent of photographing and filming themselves having sex. This is a gross invasion of privacy, an intense humiliation, but they are so desperate. When their letters and other material evidence have been rejected, they've gone this far. There was even one case of a man who did this. He filmed himself having sex with his partner. He submitted to the court him being penetrated by his partner. And the judge turned around and said, or the Home Office barrister, I can't remember which, turned around and said, I notice that you don't have an erection while you're being penetrated. You're obviously not gay. Or words to that effect. I mean, these are the depths of depravity to which our asylum system has sunk. And when you think about it, many of these refugees come from cultures where there is great shame about any form of nakedness, let alone sex. This is meant to be a very private matter. So for them to go to these extremes is emotionally and psychologically a form of abuse. But they're so desperate, they feel the need to do it. So it's very clear to me that the asylum system is not functioning in the interests of LGBT refugees. They have one of the highest refusal rates on a first application of any social group of refugees. You know, the Home Office does not subject religious, ethnic or political refugees to the same standards of proof and evidence. That's wrong. That's wrong to treat people who have suffered so much in this way. Of course, people do have to provide evidence. You know, you can't just come and claim to be gay and claim to seek asylum on the grounds of persecution. You do have to provide the evidence. But when that evidence has been provided, it is truly shocking if the government turns around and says your claim is rejected. Another issue is the ongoing question of homophobic and transphobic hate crime. We know from recent surveys in the last 2 or 3 years that about 1/3 of all LGBTI people in this country have been victims of hate crimes on account of their sexuality or gender identity. 1/3. That's hundreds of thousands of people. We also know that more than half of all young people in our schools who are LGBTI say that they suffered bullying in the classroom or in the school playground. Yet, even today, nearly half of all schools have no anti-bullying program that specifically addresses homophobic and transphobic bullying. Sex and relationship education. It's crap for straight kids, but it's even worse for LGBTI ones. You know, the standards of sex and relationship education in our schools are woefully inadequate. Young people say time and time again they were not good enough. But added to that, most schools do not include LGBTI issues in their sex and relationship education. Sex and relationship education should be for every child. The purpose is to help young people lead responsible and healthy, happy lives. We all know that in our adult life, sex and relationships are very important. You know, the person you love is probably one of the most important things in your life. Yet we're not preparing LGBTI kids or their straight counterparts to have that happiness and fulfillment. And this is happening at a time when we're learning that, yet again, figures for HIV infections amongst gay and bisexual men, particularly young gay and bisexual men, are on the increase. In London, 1 in 8 gay and bisexual men who go on the gay scene now have HIV. That's a shocking statistic. And nearly all those young people say they didn't get either LGBTI appropriate sex and relationship education or LGBTI appropriate safer sex information at their school. That is a massive failure. And for any of you who are interested, there is a campaign now which has been launched to encourage, in fact, to demand that the government make sex and relationship education compulsory in every school, because currently it's not, and that it is inclusive of LGBTI kids and issues. So please support that campaign. The final thing I'd say on the positive side in terms of going forward. Given those rather alarming figures of people who believe that homosexuality is mostly always wrong, given the scale of homophobic hate crime and bullying, we do need to challenge it. And education has a very key role to play. We all know that young people are not born homophobic or transphobic. They're not born biphobic. They're not born with any kind of prejudice. They take on prejudice as they grow up because of the bad influences of adults and peers around them. So if we can get to young people at an early age to encourage understanding and acceptance, I believe we can help challenge those negative homophobic attitudes. So what I'd like to see is every school be required by law to have equality and diversity lessons from the very first year of primary school and continuing throughout the child's life. Not just on homophobic and transphobic prejudice, but also to challenge sexism, racism, and all other forms of prejudice. I mean, it's obvious, if we want a kinder, gentler, more caring society, we need to educate people. And I think that equality and diversity lessons, they're not a panacea, but where they're being tried, the indications are that the levels of prejudice are much lower. That's the way we need to go. The problem is, we don't have a government that is committed to those very simple things. They're too afraid of the religious lobby, the Daily Mail, UKIP, and the rest. Well, we need to build a popular movement, a campaign, which says that these issues are important, that we expect our government to ensure that the education system cultivates an ethos of equality and diversity from the get-go. That's the way I think ultimately we help transform and change the culture to ensure that LGBTI people in future will have less prejudice, less hate crime, less discrimination, and less bullying. Thank you.